let's think about this for a second. Capitalism leads to a wider distribution of wealth. Before, the only people that could be wealthy were the people who owned the land. But now you don't need any land in order to create lots of wealth. So that means that more people can be wealthy, right? But now, if more people can be wealthy, what does the golden rule tell us about political power? First off, what is the golden rule?
Person that controls the wealth has the power.
Right. Whoever has the gold makes the rules, right? So that's not the one that you maybe learned in church, but this is the one that actually rules the world, okay? The golden rule, whoever has the gold makes the rules, right? And because more people own the gold, more people are involved in making the rules, right? So just think about, in your own experience with US history, who were the American revolutionaries? American revolutionaries were not nobles, they were property owners. Adams, Washington, Jefferson, right? And so they actually had wealth, okay? And because of that, they essentially set up a system where they ruled, okay? If you think about, you think about it, when the Constitution was first in effect, most people were left out. Most people couldn't participate, right? It was only the wealthy. And we always say, property owning white males, and we say that as if property owning white males is a bad thing to be. Yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But the main thing here is that it was only because property owning white males were the only ones, wait a minute, property owning white males were the only ones who could hold wealth, essentially, right? And because of that, they end up being in control of everything, okay? Questions, comments about that? Okay, so then one of the things that happens, okay, let's think about this. Remember we talked about the other day, laissez-faire capitalism, right? We talked about how Adam Smith said that because the amount of wealth is unlimited, people should be allowed to use their own enlightened, or should be able to pursue their own enlightened self-interest, which means that people should be allowed to work to make as much money as they want, and that the government should keep its hands off. That's what laissez-faire means. Laissez-faire means the government keeps its hands off of the economy and lets the economy run itself. The invisible hand essentially is what runs the economy. But the idea behind that is that everybody that can get wealthy will get wealthy, and those people who don't want to get wealthy or are not willing to put in the effort will not get wealthy. That's the way it's supposed to work, okay? And in reality, what's supposed to happen with capitalism, the way that Adam Smith imagined it, was that capitalism would not produce a two-class system with a wide gap, right? Like we see the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the reason why is because as soon as somebody started making lots of money, somebody else would come up with something a little bit better, and that would take away some of the first person's clout, I guess you could say, in the marketplace. And so because of competition, there would never emerge this class wage inequality, right? Income inequality. Okay, so what really happens though is that the wealthy people, rather than allowing the government to keep its hands off, essentially come to control the government, and they use the government to protect their own interests. You guys follow what I'm saying here? So it's supposed to be, the government's supposed to be completely hands off the economy. And if you ask any capitalist today, they'll say, oh yeah, the government shouldn't have anything to do with the economy, except that we want to make sure that they protect our interests, right? And our interests are, I'm going to make lots of money. So if I'm big pharma, I'm going to make sure that the government acts in a way that makes sure that my company, my industry makes lots of money. And if I'm in coal or fossil fuels, I'm going to do the same thing, whatever it is, right? So what ends up happening then is that rather than the government keeping its hands off this laissez-faire, the government actually becomes the interest of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, right? You guys follow me here? And again, I'm not a communist, but this is actually the way it works, okay? You can look at it and see, okay? But now here's what's really interesting is that people who are capitalists will say, well, the government shouldn't have anything to do with private industry, pretty much only when it comes to labor relations, right? Because what they're saying is the government should never step in and advocate for the working class, right? Instead, the government's supposed to be on the side of the owners. You see what I'm saying? So that's that argument that you hear. You hear people who are conservatives and say, well, the government should keep its hands off, right? Well, yeah, if they want the government to keep its hands off, then stop having the government do your bidding, essentially, right? That makes sense to you guys? Questions, comments? Okay, well, anyway, that's the reality of it, all right?
I think it's funny that
You think it's funny?
talking about like laissez-faire, like hands off during like the whole coronavirus and everything, we're just like pumping like trillions into the stock market or the economy to try to keep it alive so that it wouldn't go under. But that's the government getting involved in capitalism basically, and other people's when they should just leave their hands off.
Well, yeah, I agree. The thing though is, and one of the things that we'll see as we go further into the course is that laissez-faire capitalism is an unconscionably brutal system because it ends up with a very tiny group of people having enormous amounts of wealth and almost everybody else having nothing. Okay, yeah. That's the way.
Like
that's the way. If you leave it
right now,
if you leave it unregulated, that's what it will happen. And so what happens in the 19th and 20th centuries is that different governments will intervene in different ways to regulate laissez-faire capitalism, right? So in the United States, it was the progressives and it was the New Deal, the Great Society, maybe some of the stuff that Biden's trying to do now, right? In England and in other places in Europe, it's government ownership of industries so that industries aren't able to exploit the people. But the point is that all of these things are moves to mitigate laissez-faire capitalism. Because if you don't mitigate laissez-faire capitalism, the big kind of consequence of that more than likely would be revolution. Because when people are dying, they don't just lay down in the street and die. All right, well, the one last thing that kind of comes from this then is going to be the rise of the middle class, all right? The middle class, remember when we talked about the fiefdom, the feudal system, there were lords and there were peasants, right? And then when we get into the industrial age, there are bourgeoisie and there are proletarians, right? But one of the things that happens is that because of the complexity of machinery in the industrial era, it becomes necessary to educate workers. Workers end up going into work with more than just their labor. They go in there with knowledge, right? And that knowledge is something that they can bargain with, all right? And so what ends up happening is there's a new class that's created. It's a kind of a managerial class. People have to somebody has to be there to manage the factory, to run the factory. Owners can't do it anymore, and workers can't work, right, without somebody running the factory, essentially. And that's going to be the rise of the middle class, okay? One of the things that you could think about, and this is actually what happened in the United States, is that when the middle class exercises its power, the middle class becomes the ruling class. Okay, so if we look at, for example, after the progressive era, the middle class essentially ran. They were the ruling class, I guess you could say. Same thing in a way after the New Deal. And one of the ways you can know it is that people used to, people who were running for office used to try to convince everybody that they were just like you, the middle class, right? But that's what it used to be like. How many of you guys have heard politicians lately say, oh, you should vote for me because I'm working at a McDonald's or something like that, right? Nobody says that, okay? Except for AOC, right? She used to be a bartender, right? But at any rate, the point here is that the middle class, if it exercises its power because of the golden rule, will be the ruling class. The problem is almost everywhere, and now including the United States, the working class works against its own interests. It supports people who are against their interests. And that's something that's called false consciousness. We'll just leave that for now, right? But at any rate, we could see it in the United States that the middle class was the robust ruling class in the middle of the 20th century. Okay, questions, comments about this? So that is one of the results then of industrialization, is this rise of democracy.